Yeah, thank you as my campaign manager. It's a real honor to be part of this program, and I have to tell you that I've been really impressed with the presentations and the discussions that have taken place today. And I'm hoping this next one, the gritty discussion of money, will just build on some of the ideas that have taken place. But I'd like to make just a couple opening comments before I introduce the panel and frame this particular discussion. And it goes to the whole theme of this particular legislative retreat. And that is that the economy and the educational system are intrinsically linked. And no one will ever argue that a strong economy is dependent on a well-educated workforce. And nobody will argue that a well-educated workforce is dependent on a strong pre-K to 12 education system. So everyone's in agreement with the principles. But when we get down to figuring out what does that educational system look like, how is education administered and implemented in today's world, and then the thorny discussion that we're going to have today, and I say it's thorny because it's thorny across the country. How do you finance public education in the most efficient way possible, preserving the best in education? And frankly, when Brad Smith talked about the learning styles of the digital natives, those 10-year-olds, he framed a whole new population of students that are really going to require a whole new way of instruction. Because the learning styles have changed, instructional styles have to change. And tomorrow we have the benefit of hearing from some of the exemplary programs here in West Virginia that are really moving in the direction of adapting instructional strategies and the preparation of teachers to keep pace with those ever-changing ways in which students learn and thrive. And it's a huge challenge because it's moving at breakneck speed, as we've heard earlier. The whole issue, though, of how we finance it, this is the big question. Legislatures across the country are struggling with the best way to preserve what's being done properly, where are the best illustrations, how to come up with the best return on investment of tax dollars. Because you're all accountable to your taxpayers for the public coffers. And it's a tough, tough decision. And we're going to have a panel today starting with a national perspective. And we have Dan Thatcher from the National Council of State Legislatures, who's going to give us a broad perspective of what other states are doing, how they're struggling with the whole financing question. And then we're going to have commentary from 3 West Virginians who really know the financial system inside and out. Mark Murchow from the Department of Revenue, Mike McKown from the West Virginia State Budget Office, and John Deskins from West Virginia University College of Business and Economics. And I'll give you an overview of each of their dossiers in a moment. But I think what is important about looking at both internal experts and national overview is how to figure out what we can learn from other states, what needs to be adapted in West Virginia, and how it fits with what expertise we have within the state. And while sometimes it's very easy to say, let's do what X is doing, let's do what Y is doing, I was really taking with Brad Smith's Toyota 7-to-1 method of decision making, because I think while there is much to learn from other communities across the country, having a variety of options and then coming up with a debate to sort of distill those kind of models to make sense for the West Virginia dynamic, the West Virginia characteristics, and the assets that we have within West Virginia. So I would ask you to think about that as you hear from Dan about what other states are doing, but also what makes the most sense for the state of West Virginia. I would also add that because the majority of this audience are legislators, because you bear the responsibility for financing, let's make this session as interactive as possible. Let's be conversational. Please ask questions as we go. But first, let me provide you with a brief overview of the presenters themselves. So, as I said, Dan Thatcher is program principal with the National Conference of State Legislatures, and he'll be our primary presenter. And prior to that, Dan was the education finance staffer at the National Conference of State Legislators. He covered education finance, Common Core standards, and he has, with funding from Gates and Hewlett Foundation, he's been tracking statewide education finance developments and Common Core implementation and legislation across the country. He's worked with state legislatures in a number of different capacities and was an intern, a Hinkey intern for the Utah State Legislature in 2004. He has a background in political science from the University of Utah, a law degree from the University of Denver. We also have, from West Virginia, Mark Murchow, Deputy Secretary, Department of Revenue. And Mark works closely with the Governor's Cabinet and the State Budget Office on fiscal policy. In 1994, he was with the Global Leaders for the Southern Forum, sponsored by Bell South Corporation, consultant to the Governor's Commission on Fair Taxation Project. He has authored a study of tax incentive programs in West Virginia and significant reforms in tax legislation in the early part of the 2000s, and is a participating member of the current Tax Modernization Project. Mark hails from Franklin Township, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I found out earlier, my hometown. Graduated from Edinburgh University in public management for Carnegie Mellon University. We have John Deskins, who is Director of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research at West Virginia University and Assistant Dean of the College of Business and Economics. And John's research has focused on state economic development, small business economics, government tax and expenditure policy, and he's examined the relationship between state policy and entrepreneurial activity, particularly the role of education spending in state economic growth, which will be important to this discussion. And then we have Mike McKown, who's the director of the West Virginia Budget Office, where he works closely with the governor and legislature on the state's budget. And I think he just drove up right from Charleston, where there were some budget meetings going on this afternoon. So he's fresh from the highway. And he's worked with West Virginia state government under 5 different agencies, earned his CPA certification in '86, began his government service as legislative auditor in the '80s, an accountant with the Governor's Office of Community Development, and chief accountant with the Division of Commerce in 1989, and also particularly relevant today, Director of Accounting and Budget with the Department of Education in 2006. So let's start with our presentation by Dan, and then we'll turn to some comments from our West Virginia representatives. But as I said, please ask questions as we go. This is a really critical element of how the West Virginia education system looks moving forward. Dan?
Thank you. I think I'll just sit right here if that's fine with everyone. And if I really need to make a point, I'll stand up. So on a clarification on my background, I cover education finance for NCSL, and then in 2009, well, it was 2011, I came back to work for them. I took a brief break, and they asked me if I would cover the Common Core, because no one else on our program wanted to. And I said, sure, why not? Little did I know then that it was going to explode into this time-consuming debate. And I call myself a veteran of the Common Core Wars. And we were one of the few organizations that towed a narrow line on that issue, that we were neither for or against, which was hard to do. But anyway, thank you very much for having me. Thank you for inviting me to West Virginia. This is my first time in West Virginia. I just discovered this morning that, so there's the legislator Daniel Thatcher in Utah, and I got a question if I was related. So I looked up my ancestor, Hezekiah Thatcher, and he was from Berkeley County, West Virginia. I had no idea I had West Virginia roots. But anyway, I'm pleased to know that. Thank you, thank you. Yeah, I'm not, this time I flew back, Hezekiah walked across the country. So let's see if I can get this to work. Maybe I'll jump over to the...
Point in that direction.
Oh, there we go. Yes. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. So this... here we go. This is going to be a very broad overview, very quick. I apologize. There is, I just want to let you know at the end of this slide deck, you'll have access to it later, but I have all the sources that I reference and links to them. So if you have any questions or want to read more about what I'm talking about, it's all available at the end of this, this slide presentation that you can download. And NCSL, we're located in Denver. We were started in 1975. We are a bipartisan organization. For the legislators in the room, we are your organization. You pay us dues. In return, we give you nonpartisan research and technical assistance and advice. And we hold a lot of meetings where we try to bring everyone together from around the country to discuss ideas, share ideas, and then we also advocate on behalf of state legislatures before the federal government. So to give a broad overview, I'm first going to talk about the topography of education finance today, where states are at with finance and funding education, and then a little bit into the anatomy of school finance systems, how they work and operate across most states, and then a little bit about the notion of productivity in education. So to the topography of where states are at in education finance. We are in a new normal, as it's been said. Arne Duncan said it first, and then it's been echoed by other conservative commentators like, I'm forgetting his name now at the American Enterprise Institute. But I'm going to first talk about some misconceptions about where we are at with funding in the United States. We are, every year on average, we spend over $600 billion on public K-12 education. That's roughly about 4 to 5% of our GDP on average over the last 10 years. The average per pupil expenditure across the country is just over $11,000. And this is all based upon the most recent data we have available, which is for fiscal year 14. A lot of people think that public education is primarily funded through local property tax. It's actually less than a third of revenues come from local property tax dollars. A lot of people think, this is borne out in polling data, that the federal government provides about a third of all revenues for public education. It's actually less than 10%. And there's actually parity between what the United States spends on defense and public education. A lot of times people think that we spend a lot more on defense, but it's actually a level of parity. Now, what I'm going to show you now is what states have been spending. These are the budget numbers from states, state budgets, and what the shares that they've been spending on certain programs, state-level programs, since 1995. And what I really want you to pay attention to is the shares between Medicaid and K-12. The white line indicates the passage of the Affordable Care Act and the subsequent expansion of Medicaid. Since that time, since 2009, we have seen a steady growth in state expenditures on Medicaid, and it's a share of all state spending, and then the share of spending on K-12 education has declined. And this is a theme that we're seeing throughout most states. What's going to happen next, we don't know. It's a big question. If anyone knows that, you can make a lot of money. Now, Now this is looking at just the state expenditures on K through 12 education. And this, again, does not include local contributions. The blue bar is just general fund spending at the bottom. And you can see that the middle line, the middle of it is 2009, the peak of spending on K through 12 education. And we're still a little bit below peak spending. To be precise, around $550 below per pupil below peak spending. These are all aggregate numbers across the country and accounted for inflation. And what does that impact on local governments and local education systems in terms of employment? So the starts at I know it's kind of small for those who can't read in the back, but it does start at 1960. The gray bars are recessions, and at the beginning of the Great Recession, we saw a major drop in local education employment, which is primarily teachers. So that highlight in the red circle there indicates local education employment as defined by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So we're about 4% below, 3 to 4% below employment where it was at peak in 2008. And this is interesting, primarily because there's a lot of there's some scholars out there who think that there's already too many adults in the education system. In 1970, there were 58 teachers to every 1,000 pupils. Today, that's at the peak in 2008, it was 127 pupils, or teachers to every 1,000 pupils, and now we're at around 120. So there's a number of reasons why, though, there's been an increase in adults in the system, and one is that special education has had some role to play in it, that the explosion of special education students has required more specialized adults in the system. In the 1970s, it was 8% of the student population had special needs, and now we're about 13%. The special education population has increased by about 2.4 million students. A number of states have also enacted strict class size restrictions, which has required the hiring of more teachers, obviously. So I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as I can, and I'm sorry if this is way too fast. If you have any questions, stop me and let me know. This is my two sons, Jack and Grant, which Grant's the blonde-haired one and Grant's the darker-haired one. I always like to have a little break because, when we're talking about numbers at the end of the day, it's hard to follow, especially when I'm talking really fast. So I think they're handsome. Anyway, how school finance systems work in most states. 80% of the funding for schools is distributed through the formulas that you write as state legislators. However, school boards decide how to spend that and how to distribute it within their school districts, which is one thing that, one horizon of education finance policy that's interesting is how to create greater equity within schools, within a school district. We've been working since the 1970s to create greater equity across school districts, so now the new horizon is how do we get schools to have greater equity in schools, resources for schools. Federal dollars, as I mentioned, only 10%, but they enjoy an enormous amount of leverage in how those dollars are spent and in dictating policy. There's a great presidential essay from Deborah Cunningham, who was the president of the Association for Education, Finance, and Policy. There's a link to it in the back of my presentation where she talks about how states can take that same model and leverage their state aid to change policy on the ground. Interesting notion. So the most common form of funding formula across the states is the foundation formula. It's been around in earnest since for about 40 years now. And I don't want to get too much into the algebra of this, but I have a quick example of how this works. Basically, this state legislature sets a foundation amount. And how it determines that foundation amount varies, but most states back into it based upon available revenue. Some states actually have some kind of commission or some kind of report that they've they've asked to be conducted on what would be the adequate amount for their state. And so they kind of, or it's been litigated and they can't come to it that way. But suffice it to say that, go back here, that you come with the foundation amounts and then figuring out the state aid per pupil is a combination of the local tax rate that states require local governments to spend and the property value per pupil in those districts. And this really only works if the state sets a minimum levy. Otherwise, you have some kind of different formula. So this is just a sample of how it works in some states. Say the foundation amount is $7,000, and then talking about cost differentials in education, the difference that it costs districts to educate certain different types of students to reach the same level of achievement as the basic student. That's where these weights come into play. Other schools or states have cost differentials for size of the district or cost of living. But in this instance, I'm just looking at, for the example, looking at the cost differentials for these different types of students. And as you can see, once you calculate for all the types of students using the weights, the foundation amount goes up $590 above the $7,000. Then how does the state determine how it distributes that money? Again, here's the formula that I talked about. This is the minimum required tax rate. In this example, will be 20 mils or 2% of the property wealth. And here is 3 districts. Let's pretend the state only has 3 districts, each with 500 pupils, and each with a different tax base. And you can see that the amount of state aid, based upon the level of tax base and the type of weighted students that each district has, they get a different amount from the state. So in this scenario, the state would provide just over $4 million. Now, there are some states and some districts that can, when they levy the minimum amount required by the state, they actually generate more revenue above and beyond the foundation amount. Some states deal with that money differently. Wyoming, for example, recaptures it and redistributes it across the state. Montana has something similar. Colorado requires that even if you raise revenue above and beyond the foundation amount, you still get something like $30 per pupil. So even if you're one of these really high wealth school districts, you're still getting money from the state. And so this is just the basic approach that just about all states, 45 states, have taken at this point in the country. And I understand why West Virginia, you guys can explain better to me, but I imagine you have something very similar to something like this. And this is a very simplified version of it. So this is how it looks for 2014. The blue on the bottom is local revenue, and the red is state, and the yellow is the federal contribution. And these are all the states lined up for 2014. And you can see just the distribution of state aid versus local aid, where Vermont has a very little contribution from their local governments. They have a statewide property tax. They essentially run the property tax system in the state. On the other end is Illinois, that has one of the least progressive property or school finance systems in the country. It relies so heavily on local property tax contributions. The bar to the left is West Virginia, and then the U.S. average is in the middle. And that's what that represents right there. And so I don't know how I'm doing on time. Am I talking too fast? Keep going fast. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so let me just, I think what I'll do is quickly go through this and get to what I think is really the most exciting stuff. This is about consolidation, and I'm just going to skip this real quick, except for this, this finding here. Annual operating spending per pupil declines by 61% when 300 pupil districts merge, and by 50% when 1,500 pupil districts merge. This is from Duncombe and Yinger's research in New York. And this is, again, linked to the back of the slide deck. And some recommendations. Really, the number one recommendation when considering consolidation is to do it on a case-by-case basis and not have a blanket policy across the state. But this is the thing that I find that's really interesting and at this point in time in school finance research. And this is Marguerite Rose's research on return on investment superstars and what she calls school effects. And what she did is, I tried to get West Virginia's graph, but I couldn't. But this is a return on investment plot graph. The y-index is student achievement, essentially, and then on the bottom is adjusted per pupil spending. And so she was looking at, these districts up there that spend below the average of the state and are getting above average results. These are all rural districts. She calls them the ROI superstars. And what she found, she tried to find out why it is that they're achieving so well. What's the secret sauce, as she calls it? And she went in and dissected what they're spending, how they're distributing their resources. So just for example, I want to get these numbers right. So she looked at the share of spending on instruction, 60% on instruction, 8% on student and staff support, 11% on administration, and 20% on other operations, food, transportation, all the other things. And that same distribution was the same among the high-achieving superstars and everyone else. So she's trying to figure out what's the secret sauce. And she found that districts can spend money the exact same way with the exact same type of student population, and they'll still get different results. So she has concluded that it's really about the importance of relationships within the districts, within the schools, and that they use data to track spending with outcomes and test results. Each district, the ROI superstars, they had a great deal of flexibility among the staffing, and she uses the word self-reliance and ingenuity, respect for costs. And then when you look at this after this presentation, you can see more examples, and these were also from Marguerite's work prior to that research. I think I could provide more of the state examples when we get into the discussion.
I'd like to get enough time for comment and questions, but please come back into the conversation, Dan. And in particular, if funding doesn't have a direct relation to student performance, I think one of the questions that I'd like the group to entertain is which states or which districts are spending in a particular way that's more effective, because all education funding is primarily personnel funding. But how that is structured, I think, is pretty telling. So I'm going to allow, who wants to go first on the panel?
I can speak to the way that we fund schools here in West
Please.
Virginia.
Do you want to use the microphone here or there?
That'll be fine. I'll do it quickly.
Yeah, I think a short description of how West Virginia's composition sizes up to the national picture.
We are a bit of a, we think nationally, of course, we're a small rural state. Our funding formula, as most people in here knows, it's driven by net enrollment. Over the last 30 years, we have lost 28% of our net enrollment. In 1980, we had 381,000 students. 1980, 381,000. Today, we have 273,000. We've lost 108,000 students since 1980. And that's counting, we even count 3- and 4-year-olds now that we did not count back in 1980. So that being the driver, our school aid formula, especially over the last few years, the bottom line has actually shrunk. When you take the teacher's retirement out of the formula, which is the one thing that has, and PEIA, and the growth of a local share, the state funding in the school aid formula over the last few years is actually is smaller than it was probably 10 years ago. So the state general revenue share is actually decreasing, which it should when you have that much loss in net enrollment. So the formula does work the way it's supposed to. West Virginia's problem is, and the reason our per pupil costs are so high, has a lot to do with our unfunded liability in the teachers' retirement system, which next year's budget, the FY18 budget that we're going to be talking about here real soon in the upcoming legislative session, if you fully fund the teachers' retirement system, you have to put another $71 million into it, about $70 million when you net some things out. That's to keep it at the current on the current schedule, where we're on a 40-year payment plan. It was started in 1994. It's to the unfunded liabilities to be paid off 100% funded in the year 2034. So we're a good ways into that, and we're well on our way to doing that. But it does cost money, especially when you don't earn 7.5% interest every year on your investments, which we did not last year. We earned 0.3%. Hence the big inflow required from general revenue. Also, the teachers' retirement system just did an experience study. They do that every 5 years. This was the year they did that. It's bad timing on that, but they look at the numbers, and teachers who are retired are actually living longer than they anticipated 5 years ago. So that's going to cost the formula another $25 million too, which is in that $70 million figure. So that the cost of the unfunded liability consists of two parts. It's not earning enough investments last year, and an experience study that has rated some mortality rates of teachers who are retired. So those are the big drivers in the school aid formula, driven by net enrollment. It's a complicated formula, but there's 7 major steps, and steps 1 and 2 are the teachers. Steps 1 is teachers, 2 is service personnel, and 3 is the fixed costs associated with those salaries, and that's 85% of the school aid formula. So personnel, based upon the number of kids in school, is what drives our formula.
So, why don't we hear from Mark so we can get the state perspective, and we'll wrap up with the academic.
Mike talked about the formula. I'll talk about the funding side. Somewhat similar, the federal funds account for about 10% of school funding in West Virginia, very similar to the national average. On the state and local split, about 60% is state, 30% is local. So we're above the national average. There's much more state dollars going into education and fewer local dollars on the percentages. The state dollars, we mostly come out of general revenue, personal income tax, very broad-based personal income tax structure, a very broad-based sales tax structure. We're probably one of only about 10 states that taxes a significant amount of services. We have a severance tax, which is a big part of the general revenue fund, corporate tax. We have basically almost all the major taxes. At the local level, the funding is property taxes. And the property tax in West Virginia is different than other states. In West Virginia, residential real estate taxes are about 1/3 of the national average. Commercial real estate taxes are only about 75% of the national average. And if you put that together, we were at the national average, those property taxes on real estate would be about $800 to $900 million more than what we currently yield. So that's made up by other types of sources, including significant amounts of state general revenue. But we rely very heavily on property taxes from mineral industries in West Virginia, and that has the effect of creating significant revenue volatility from one year to the next. In the past year, one county grew by more than 40%, while a couple other counties declined by more than 11.5%. And we had, in terms of the school aid formula, there's a local share requirement of all counties, and that local share as a share of the total property taxes probably ranges somewhere between 40% in some counties to as much as 90% in other counties. It depends upon excess levies. Counties are allowed to levy excess levies, voter approved, and the voter approved revenues are probably about 60% of all property taxes are voter approved levies. So every 5 years, you're subject to renewal. You can either go forward or not go forward. In counties that have a lot of mineral properties or a lot of personal property, particularly business property, excess levies are very popular. In counties that are mostly residential or farm, they're far less popular. We've had some issues with the volatility recently where some of our top counties, like Boone County, we used to be the #1 county in the state. They're still one of the top 15 counties, but they had a 10.5% drop in a single year on the books. The state makes up the foundation part, but all the extras that that school system built in when revenues were high are now falling out from under them. So that's become an issue. There's also a great deal of difference between the counties. In Doddridge County, which is economically one of the poorest counties in the state, but in terms of property tax, it actually funds its entire local share because of so much natural gas. The property tax yield in Doddridge County is about 3.8 times as much as the median county in West Virginia. At the opposite end of the spectrum is Work County, which is only about 53% of the median county in the state. So tremendous differences. Residents out of local property taxes contribute a whole lot less in West Virginia than just about any other state. Greater contributions are coming from the sales tax and the income tax and from various business property taxes.
Thank you, Mark. Especially from someone who comes from Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, where the vast majority of education funding is property tax.
Property and earned
And
income
local.
credit, earned income
Yes,
tax.
that's
Yes.
right. But it's wildly varying per pupil cost by district, so interesting
Uh,
comparison.
One of the notices in Pennsylvania, the residents, including students, we go to school board meetings, we take active part in what's going on because school boards set taxes. In West Virginia, some of us don't even know who our school board members are.
We do. John, would you like-
I'll just stay over here if that's okay. Jim, you said you'll close with the academic. I'll tell you, I will take that label. I've been called much worse things than the academic. I just will say really quickly to add to Mark's presentation, we generally like to fund public schools with property taxes because that's the most stable source of revenue. Sales taxes, consumption taxes in general, income taxes in general are more volatile than property taxes, so we like to fund one of our most important public services demands with that really stable source of revenue. Wouldn't you agree, Mark?
We agree, except our revenue's not stable because we rely so much more heavily on minerals and much less on real estate than normal.
Yeah, I guess I'm referring just the typical real estate
But typically,
part.
real estate, and also real estate taxes, there's a tie-in. If you have good schools, your real estate values will rise. It's good for your home. I see less of a connection in West Virginia that way than I saw in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania and New York and other states, you have high real estate values in various communities, and they're very proud of it.
Right.
And it supports the school system. In West Virginia, we're struggling to keep our values down.
It helps provide incentives for the community members to make sure that those schools are good,
Right.
so that their property values are
Well,
corresponding.
they move together. It's a good thing.
Yeah, it's a good way to align incentives. Anyway, to move on to my comments, I was asked to talk about the broader economic context. Many of you have heard me speak many times, and you know that my role is to pour cold water on the conversation, and that's pretty much what I do and what I'm about to do. But the fact of the matter in West Virginia, we've suffered greatly since 2012. We lost about 17,000 jobs since 2012. We suffered a really severe recession in 2015 and through the first part of 2016. We do think that the economy has stabilized for the last 5 months or the last 6 months. A lot of signs are pointing to the idea that we have hit bottom and that we are once again returning to growth. But still, the bottom line is, even with growth, we expect growth that's only about 2/3 as fast as the growth that we see nationally in terms of employment growth. With that growth, for West Virginia, it's going to take us more than 5 years to get to the employment high that we saw in January 2012. Just to repeat, it's going to be more than 5 years until we get back to where we were January 2012 in terms of the jobs lost that our state has suffered through. On top of that, total economic output in West Virginia is the same as where it was 3 or 4 years ago. total economic output for all industries except energy is also the same as where it was 4 or 5 years ago, pointing to the lack of industrial diversification that we see in West Virginia. And of course, we fare poorly on a whole bunch of other statistics, crucial things like labor force participation, educational attainment, health outcomes, these things. So we have a lot of economic challenges. The reason I say this is not to dampen the mood in the room, even though that's probably the side effect. But the reason that I say this is we can't just hang our hopes on a rebound in the state's economy. Even though we think the economy's flattened out and it's going to return to growth, it's going to be sluggish growth, and we can't just say, okay, revenues are going to start improving now that the recession's over with and we don't have to worry about it. We do have to worry about it, and we have to think about outside-of-the-box solutions to overcome the educational funding problems that we face in West Virginia. That said, and there's no question how important human capital is to economic development. Economic development's a very multifaceted problem. We have to think about how attractive is West Virginia to potential businesses compared to our competitor states like Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee. That question of attractiveness depends on things like the regulatory climate, the tax climate, the quality of infrastructure, but it also depends on the human capital. To get a business to locate in West Virginia, many of you have heard me say this before, to get a business to locate here, that business has to be confident that it can find the workers that it needs who are well educated, who have the job skills that are needed, and who are healthy and drug-free. So human capital is an absolutely integral component of making ourselves attractive to potential businesses. So the challenges are there. The importance cannot be overstated. Just real quickly, one statistic. It's hard to overstate the value of education. Just look at the labor market. In West Virginia, in 2015, college grads earned 56% more than those with just a high school diploma. College grads earned 123% more than those with less than a high school diploma. I mean, the labor market is overwhelming evidence. Education, good education, pays. It's a crucial component of this economic development picture. But outside of the box solutions, we have to think about ways to get more out of the government resources that we have. We have to look at the structure and the nature and the way that responsibilities are allocated between the state and local and regional government units in West Virginia and make sure that we're really getting the most out of the resources that we have. We should push as hard as we possibly can to study the way that our government is structured to make sure that we're getting the most bang for our buck. And I would for sure welcome questions surrounding introducing a competitive element into education. In economics, we constantly talk and preach about the value of competition in markets and how competition, under the right circumstances, brings everybody up. A competitive element helps make people better off. It helps make for a more efficient use of our scarce resources. It's a win-win in so many ways under the right circumstances. And there should be a discussion of competitive element in education as well. You can't just translate the nature of competition between the market and education without some caveats, without some special considerations. But the point remains that introducing competition in public education even can have benefits if it's done the right way, and I'd like to see more discussion, more research, more push to see if we can find ways to introduce competition to serve as an outside-of-the-box way to bring up our educational outcomes without just simply throwing more dollars at the problem without changing anything. Part of what I'm pointing to here is the question around charter schools. I'm not necessarily saying whether they're good or bad, but that question of is there a way to introduce competition to help lift everybody up, it's an important discussion, and charter schools are one part of that discussion. Interestingly enough, I saw an article about charter schools. They're in the paper all the time, those articles, but I saw one the other day in one of the West Virginia papers, and the article didn't even mention competition and how those schools may introduce a competitive element to force everybody to be better. The article didn't even mention that, which is the whole point of charter schools. So I'm just trying to make sure the discussion is on track, right? The point there is, can we introduce a competitive element to bring everybody up? That should be a part of the discussion going forward.
Hold that thought. And I'd like to go back to some alternative financing methods, looking at those structures that are outside of the traditional formula. But first, we're short on time, and I'd like to make sure that there are some comments and questions from the audience. Please.
Thank you. I guess this question will be directed mainly to Mark. I was the county assessor here for 24 years, so I'm a member of that group that's sometimes perceived as being responsible for a lack of local funds going into the tax base. But I was just wondering, since we have been, since the REC decision, trying to get county assessors on board with getting the property levels to 60% of market value. I was just wondering if you could give us some kind of, I've been retired for 4 years, and give us some kind of a report on where the counties stand with the reappraisal. And the other thing I want to ask is the issue of exempting certain business personal property and inventory repeatedly comes up with the legislature, and I'm sure it'll come up again this year, which I feel would erode our tax base even further. And I lived with 20 years of various exemptions being granted for various things that eroded the tax base here and statewide. So I just wondered if you could give us a report on the reappraisal, and also on what kind of an impact you think it would have if business personal property or business inventory were exempted from the property tax.
That's a lot of questions in a short period of time there. I'll go back. The state of West Virginia broke away from Virginia because of preserving the Union slavery, but also we didn't like the property tax in Virginia. And so we decided to embed our property tax system to a large extent in our state constitution. And that started back in the 1870s when we were an agrarian society. And one of the problems when you put something in the state constitution that specific is it's very hard to change it. And that system had taxes of all personal property, at one time even household property, inventories and whatnot. And over the years there have been constitutional amendments to eliminate a few things. We eliminated Freeport inventories back in the mid-'80s. The Constitution allowed the elimination of personal property for farms. That was done away with. There was an amendment for intangible property. That was done away with. So typically states that tax only real estate, Pennsylvania, our neighbor to the north, only taxes real estate, you're going to have higher real estate tax burdens than a state that taxes a mixture of both. It's just the nature of trying to raise money from a tax. So that's the downside. The upside is on the personal property side, it's a significant burden on capital investment, particularly manufacturing and mining, and that can detract a little bit. Mining is here partly because the minerals are here, but in the case of manufacturing, it's not necessarily so geographically specific. It can be in various places, so it's a problem on the manufacturing side. On the reappraisal, good news since 1990, part of that law, and I should back up a little bit. 1932, we had a constitutional amendment imposed that put a rate limitation on, which we still live by today. So what it did is it took away the tax raising capacity from local government officials, county commissions, school boards, city councils, and it put all the pressure on the county assessor and all on the valuation side. Probably not necessarily a good thing. In other states, we worry about tax rates. In West Virginia, we worry about our assessed valuation. Different animals. So it's a lot of extra pressure on the assessors. Yeah. They're seen as the folks that raise taxes, not the. We don't know who our county commissioners are because they don't typically raise taxes or do anything like that. But there has been significant progress. It's an ongoing process, but you're supposed to reappraise every 3 years. Part of that law required a rollback of tax rates when values went up. And the tax rate for education today is a good 16% below the constitutional maximum that it was prior to when appraisal started. So the increase in the valuations have resulted in reduced tax rates. The biggest beneficiary of reduced tax rates is personal property. Personal property taxes as a share are lower today than they were back prior to that effort to reappraise property. So that's a good thing too. But those have been imposed for several years. And I'm probably taking up too much time. Did that answer your question? I mean, it's an ongoing process. It's not a one-time we're going to fix it. It's an ongoing reevaluating property every year. I might say that the low property taxes in West Virginia are costing me money. I'm a homeowner. And if I had my home in most of the other surrounding states, my valuation would rise much faster than it does in West Virginia. So even though I get the benefit of the lower tax rate, because of the other consequences that come with that, I get less appreciation in the value of my home over time. And I'm not sure that's a good thing. I like to have my wealth increase. Would you same way?
For sure.
So that's one of the consequences. Market forces tend to countervail and counteract efforts to favor certain types of property over other properties. And in West Virginia, we definitely have a great preference for residential property.
Thank you.
John, I appreciate your comments. The value of school choice and being an engine for change, and I support them very much for that same reason. While I very much want to extend freedom, flexibility, less regulation for all of our school systems, I certainly agree that they can be an engine for change by introducing that competition. Question for Mr. Thatcher. The cost of living adjustments, if you know, about how many states do include a cost of living adjustment in their formula? And then the high achieving, low spending chart that you showed, is that available for West Virginia? And then if I can, for Mark, last year Boone County saw a significant spike in uncollectibles, which resulted in us taking action in order to accelerate the relief that they would have ordinarily received under the school formula. Are there very many counties that are looking to be in a similar situation as far as uncollectibles? So those questions.
Your first question, I actually had a chart in there that listed the different cost differentials and how many each state had, and I took it out. But I think for cost of living, the number 24 sticks in my head for some reason, but I will get that specific number to you. And they rely on different measures. Some use a comparable wage index. Some use, Colorado, for example, contracts out to a in-state company to develop it each year. There's the hedonic index, and each state uses a different one. But I have that information. I'm happy to get that to you.
Will we be able to make the slides available to the participants?
We can put those up. We can
Yeah.
put the slides up on the app.
Gypsy, Joyce, we can do that? We can distribute it? Thank you.
And then your second question was again?
That high achieving, low spending chart, is West Virginia available?
I've been trying to pull it up, and I can't get it. But I do have the Excel spreadsheet upon which that was made, and so I can make that available to everyone. And I may have linked to it on my slide deck, but I'll make sure that you have access to that.
There's great effort in West Virginia to equalize funding across all counties. We're the second most equalized funded system in the country, only to Hawaii, and Hawaii's only got one district.
It helps.
So that makes it a little more difficult to get on that matrix because everybody's got the same amount of money to play with.
Yeah.
That may be part of the problem. The question on bankruptcies, we had a bunch of bankruptcies last year. Fewer bankruptcies this year, so I don't believe that's going to be as much of a problem, but there's still a problem. A number of coal companies shuttered doors. We tax machinery and equipment. That machinery and equipment is no longer being used, so its valuation goes down. And particularly the coal mining counties relied very heavily on mineral properties and personal property, far less so on residential. So I think there's still going to be downward pressure. And some of the natural gas counties, the ones that are big stars recently, you're going to see for the next couple of years a decrease because as prices go down, that affects the property valuation. So you're going to see double-digit decreases even in those counties in terms of the valuations. Hopefully they didn't spend all their money in ways that they can't undo the spending. So, and actually, the preliminary numbers for local share, property tax, for the first time in recent memory, are going to go down this year. Less revenue than last year. And it has nothing to do with homeowners, nothing to do with car owners. It all has to do with the energy sector.
Mike, were you going to make a comment on?
I was just what Mark said. I'll echo that. This local share generally grows in the school aid formula, which is the local property taxes that pay. And as it grows, the state can reduce their payments. And in FY18, you're going to see a lower local share number than you did for 17. That, as far as I know, is the first time in history that's ever happened.
Amazing.
It means statewide, the property values have decreased.
Any other questions? I have one. Oh, I'm sorry.
This can be a quick question, but I think I saw in one of your slides efficiency that is gained by larger districts. Is that true? And could you speak to that?
Yeah, so the research shows that once you get to about 5,000 pupils per district, the economies of size that can be enjoyed drop off. So it's, and that, oddly enough, if you look at the average pupil per pupil enrollment of districts in West Virginia, that's exactly where you're at. But I don't know what it gets really more complicated into like where the savings are found, and a lot of when districts consolidate, the savings will come from personnel. That there's no longer 2 administrators that are needed, for example, and so that's why instructional. When I put that slide up in the instructional expenditures, with 300 per 300 pupil districts combined, that they enjoy a decline per pupil instructional expenditures of like 60% or something like that. But then after a while, it actually, you can have diseconomies of scale. And so, but the research is really good on this, actually. It's one of the few areas of education finance research that's really solid.
One of the problems in West Virginia, if I could just...
Yes.
One of the problems in our state is unlike other states, most states' population tends to be centralized in urban areas, not in West Virginia. We're spread out. So there's a much higher transportation cost component there. And we don't have many districts that have 5,000 students. I don't know what those numbers are, but we have a lot of smaller districts in that, county systems. But it's one of the countervailing cost considerations is people are just spread out all over the place. Makes it much more difficult and more expensive, especially on the transportation side.
This is actually where actual topography comes into play too, and the research talks about this, is that if you have valleys that separate, and mountains that separate the districts that want to consolidate, that bumps up the transportation expenditures. That's, the transportation expenditures is one of the things that goes against the consolidation, absolutely.
Senator.
How can I ask this? The level of spending that's generated by the formula is about half of the general revenue budget, correct?
About 45%. Yes.
45%. So this is maybe not a question for y'all to answer, but can we live with less than 45% and still adequately fund our education system? And the reason I ask is it's statutorily driven, and I'm hearing the big problem here. I don't believe the school aid formula will be changed. I think it'll remain what it is. So the $500 million of shortfall will have to come from the other half, the other 55% of the budget. Would you agree?
If you do not change the school aid formula, let me just say the school aid formula is if you exclude PEIA and retirement,
Okay.
those numbers go down because of the decrease in the net enrollment in students. As far as how you make up a $500 million budget gap, if you take the public ed off, again, you've excluded about half the budget already. So what was a 10% cut to everybody would now become a 20% cut to everybody that you left on. I don't have an easy answer to that one.
Is the contribution to the retirement system statutorily driven?
There's a
According to the Governor Tomlin's budget.
There was
yeah.
There were a Supreme Court finding, I think, and I'm not a lawyer, in '94 that started all this funding of the unfunded liability. I think the Supreme Court said that the 40-year plan was a good plan, and that if it was ever deviated from, they certainly would hear a case on that.
Yes, because when you look at the 2.8 million or the 67% of this budget that was presented by Governor Tomlin, it's included in the list of statutorily required contributions. So so if that much of the budget, 67%, is statutorily driven, then the $500 billion has to come from the other what? 33%.
Yeah, 20, yeah, not much, right. You could cut the Department of Commerce, Ed and Arts, Veterans Department Affairs, you could cut all the General Revenue Transportation, you could cut Senior Services, you could cut the whole Department of Admin, you could cut, not that you could, the judicial and the legislative branches of government, and you still don't get $500 million.
Okay, I just wanted you to say that.
I mean, you cut them 100%, you eliminate
Well,
all those.
And
you still
now I just
don't
want to
get
ask
there.
one more question. Professor, are you sure our economy's not going to grow fast enough?
Well, it's going to grow, but I don't think we can just think that growth is going to fix all of our woes. It's going to take active.
Okay, all right.
It was mentioned earlier that a lot of states, their school aid formula, foundation formula is based on how much money they have. In West Virginia, it's based on hard-coded figures of ratios that are in code. So you could change the funding, but you'd have to change that formula code. West Virginia, by the way, is a top 16 state in terms of per pupil funding from state government. So we're one of the top in the country. And part of that is our ratio of teachers, personnel to students is one of the highest, or one of the lowest in the country. That is, there are other states that have far fewer personnel per student than we do. So that's there are ways to get about it. They're not easy ways, but there are ways of making adjustments there. But it would have to be statutorily driven.
Okay. Well, let's have a round of applause for our panel. These are your top issues.